Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Welcome to the European Development Days, and particularly this session on the European social model and the times it is going through, but also the inspiration it can give or has given and might give to other countries. As a teaser, I would say that our European social model is one in which that we have always embraced economic growth, but we let this economic growth go hand in hand also with ever-increasing levels of welfare. And we have found a kind of a divine coincidence between economic growth and welfare. You need economic growth for welfare, but if you have well-educated people, if you have healthy people, it's also good for your economic growth. And I think the second thing we have done with our European model is that we have embraced, again, economic growth, but let it go hand in hand with very different systems of distribution, redistribution. And there again, we have found some kind of a divine coincidence between the two. Economic growth is needed to redistribute, but if you redistribute, and we didn't wait for Piketty to know that, we had that gut feeling, it's also good for your economic growth. And the third thing, I think is one that we are experiencing right now and testing out, is that we try to combine economic growth with ever-growing levels of quality of life, of well-being. And I think this is, in a nutshell, as a teaser, the social model that we embrace here in Europe. And this makes Europe the world leader on the quality of life. I think these are the ingredients why we are the world leader in the quality of life. But as the President and also the Commissioner are saying time and again, we should not be complacent. Our model is under a lot of strain. There's a lot of divergence between the different member states. There are problems of fiscal sustainability of the European social welfare model, etc., etc. And these are the themes that we will be dealing with today. And as I said, the task ahead is to look at this model in a critical way and to see to what extent it can be used to promote higher standards of quality of life for everybody on this planet. It has been an inspiration for some. It has not been an inspiration for other ones. So the question remains, can it still be an inspiration? Can it be a template for other continents, for other countries? We have so far 5 very interesting speakers. One of them still has problems with his registration, so we hope he can make it. Another one is in another panel right now and will come a little bit later. But we have, I can assure you, we have 5 very interesting speakers. And we want this to be an interactive session. After each speaker, we will have 5 minutes for reflections, for remarks, for discussions, and as much as possible also for suggestions, for new ideas. So please come up with as many ideas that you have as possible. And I would like to ask you all, including the speakers, also to tweet. And you know the 2 major hashtags used during these EDDs. So it's hashtag EDD19 and then hashtag think twice. So let us make it as interactive as possible. We will first have, normally if the person who has problems with registration makes it, we will first have 3 speakers who are very much involved in the European social model, and then have 2 people from outside who will reflect on that model and see what can be done with it, to what extent it is indeed inspiring, or maybe to what extent it is not useful. The first person we have the very great honor to have our Commissioner Marianne Thyssen. She became the Commissioner for Social Affairs, Employment, Skills and Labour Mobility with this Commission in 2014. And Marianne Thyssen is both a practitioner and a politician. She was involved in the largest Belgian association of small and medium-sized enterprises. She was also involved in the association of the self-employed Christian women's organizations. And since 1991, she has been MEP, a member of the European Parliament. And she went through 5 tests, and she has been re-elected 5 times as a parliamentarian. And then with this Juncker Commission, she took up the office of Commissioner for Employment and Social Affairs. And in that sense, we have to give her the credit, and she also did it very much in tandem with the rest of the college and with the president. She is the architect, the main architect of the social house that has been built during this administration. For those who are from Europe, you know that we have the European Pillar of Social Rights, and you know that we have also a lot of legislative work being done at the European level, and I think this is really the achievement of Marianne Thyssen. So I'm very happy to invite her to take the floor and to tell us how this all came about and how they reconstructed the social house of Europe. Marianne Thyssen, very welcome.
That's yours. Dear Patrick, thank you for your nice words. Ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists also, I think we might say that Europe can be proud of its social protection. Indeed, social protection, as we know, it was pioneered in Europe. In the 1880s, the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, introduced the first groundbreaking compulsory social insurance system. He quickly extended it beyond health coverage to include accident, disability, and old age retirement. And soon other European countries followed Germany's example. And now the European social model is part of who we are. The European social market economy is at the core of our values, it's anchored in our treaty, and at the heart of our union. 8 out of 10 Europeans believe a free market and social protection should go hand in hand. In Nordic countries, social protection is almost a kind of patriotism. And with rising incomes, developing countries saw European social protection as something they too could obtain. More and more countries started to design social protection systems, and it was only natural that they would look at Europe, we could say, a global leader in social protection. But for how long? Today, social transfers reduce inequality in Europe by 33%. But Europe's social systems are nowadays under a lot of pressure. First, from the crisis, from which we are now recovering. Second, from rising inequality. And third, from the great global changes of our time. Technological change, demographic change, to name just those 2. This raises a fair question. Does the European model, the European social model, does it still have a future? And can developing countries still look to Europe for inspiration? My answer to both these questions is a resounding yes. We still need inclusive societies. First of all, for social reasons. We cannot afford to leave anybody behind. If Europe works only for some and not for others, it does not work at all. And we also need an inclusive society for economic reasons. Where there is social mobility, people invest in themselves and in their children because they know that those investments will pay off. And we as society, we of course benefit from these investments. And where there is social protection, economies are better able to withstand shocks. The most recent crisis showed us the relevance of social protection systems in a modern economy. It's true, the crisis brought unemployment and poverty, But overall, studies agree that the automatic stabilizers effects of the European systems dampened the worst effects of this crisis. And it's the social protection systems in Europe that provide these economic stabilizers. But of course, our social protection systems are much more than a shock absorber. Social protection is an investment which strengthens productivity, social cohesion, and domestic purchasing power. And that is why Europe has renewed its commitment to the European social model by proclaiming the European Pillar of Social Rights. This European Pillar of Social Rights consists of 20 rights and principles dealing with 3 main issues. It's about access to the labor market, to education, training, and lifelong learning. It is about fair labor conditions, fair working conditions, and thirdly, it is about social protection and inclusion. These rights and principles are essential for safeguarding and improving our social model. They are essential to help us reach the Sustainable Development Goals. We want to keep our social systems functioning at the same high level as today. And that's why we are turning rights into realities and the principles of the pillar into policies. And we have to do that because we are living in times of a great change that puts our societies and our social security systems under pressure. If we want our children to have good pensions, we must adjust retirement age in line with life expectancy. If we want to empower our people in the digital age, we need to make sure that they have the right skills to find another job if their job is disappearing, or to be able to pick up newly created jobs, and even to be able to keep the job they have because the content of many jobs will be changing. And if we want social protection in a digital and flexible economy, we will need to update our labor law and we will need to update our social security systems and legislation. We know that the platform economy is on the rise. For millions of people, platform work is already now their main source of income, and these numbers are sure to grow. We need to embrace the platform revolution, but prevent a platform proletariat from forming. If we want effective social protection in a flexible economy, then we need to make sure that entitlements are portable across jobs, across job statuses, across industries, and between European member states. All the things I have just mentioned, we have put in motion in the last 5 years, and much more. And that's why I believe the European social model can still be a model to the world. Here I have to tip my hat to Commissioner, my former colleague, my predecessor, Commissioner Ender. He was my predecessor as Commissioner for Employment and Social Affairs, and we could put social at the heart of our policies by building on the difficult work that Commissioner Ender and his colleagues were doing during the crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, global growth is reaching more and more people. In 1990, 36% of the world's population lived on less than $1 a day, and now that number is below 10%. The book Factfulness by Hans Rosling points out the immense global progress achieved in terms of wealth, health, and education. The developing world is better off now than Europe was during the Industrial Revolution, when Europe started to build its social model. At the same time, less than 30% of the world's population has adequate social security coverage, and more than half of the global population doesn't have any social security coverage at all. Once income starts to grow and people have their basic needs covered, the demand will come for pensions, for health care, for health and safety at the workplace. And as in Bismarck's days, it often starts with health, as we see that now when we look at requests from the Deliveroo cyclists, for instance, the first thing they are requesting is a kind of health insurance, or at least an insurance against accidents. But it's not enough to build labor laws and social protection systems. We also need to build capacity for administrations. Today we have a speaker from the Philippines with us, Mr. Lawrence Balatbat. In his country, there is social insurance, but it only covers around a third of the population. Many eligible people are not contributing to the system. The system remains fragmented with little coordination among agencies. And this is true in many countries. Beefing up public administration, building capacity, is just as important as the design of the system itself. And here we can help. The European Union has a long-standing record of providing technical support and peer-to-peer advice to partner countries. We have supported, for example, mandatory health insurance in Azerbaijan, an employment injury insurance system for Malawi, a pension reform in Mexico. We are also an active partner in the Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection, where we work with the ILO, with the World Bank, and others. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, let me say, social protection is especially important when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable. Here I mean especially our children. We know from bitter experience that economic shocks leave scars on the youngest in our societies. Children often lose out in terms of access to education, access to health, or access to other basic services. And this is why I'm especially pleased that we have on today's panel also the Nobel Prize winner, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Mr. Kailash Satyarthi. His really tireless work in the service of child welfare is an example to us all. And in the words of Nelson Mandela, I can say, there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And I think the main message, in fact, is indeed that there is no contradiction between social policy and economic policy. Both can influence each other, and together they can make for a strong, comprehensive policy. Congratulations for what you have achieved during this administration. Now we have the pleasure to invite your predecessor, Mr. Laszlo Andor. Apparently you made it to register for the European Development Days. We're very happy for that because we were a bit afraid that you would not be able to attend. Mr. Andor, indeed, he was the predecessor and he worked under what we call then the Barroso administration of the European Commission. And before that, among other things, he was a member of the board of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. As a doctor in economics, he worked in many different countries, including his own country, of course, Hungary, but also the Netherlands, the UK, the US, and so on. So he's really an international person. And I think he's very well placed to tell us more about how the European social model works and why it works, the intricacies of the model. Mr. Andor, you're very welcome. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Madam Commissioner, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is really a pleasure to be back in this discussion and share a little bit of my insight from a more academic point of view. Why? Because since stepping down from the Commission in the last 4.5 years, I have been mainly engaged in the world of academia and think tanks, and not least because there is a great interest to study the European social model, the present and the future of employment and social policies in Europe, also in order to understand what is specific and what can be shared more internationally and globally from this experience. If the question is how, of course, we are even more allowed to engage in a kind of theoretical reflection. So I collected 3 points, which I think in the European context are very, very important in order to focus the discussion, let's say, about the mechanism, the technicalities. My first point would be that in the European Union level, the social policy making is using all 3 arms of governance. What does that mean? That in the European Union, the EU does a lot of legislation, and the social portfolio also has a very significant amount of labor legislation, especially what concerns cross-border labor mobility, but also about the working conditions. So since the European Union was created, this important cycle of labor legislation began. And in every period, under every single commissioner, there is always something to add because there are new challenges, new developments. You need to upgrade or update the existing legislation. So this is not something that would be completable at some point, but there is always a need for a follow-up and facing the new challenges. But there is also a world beyond the legislation. And I'm stressing this because sometimes the stakeholders come and tell you that nothing counts unless you also legislate about things. In reality, there is a lot of what we call policy coordination in the European Union, a process to help member states learn from each other. The European Union is far from being a homogeneous place. There are good performers, but also bad performers. There are also many, many weaknesses in specific countries or specific circumstances which one country faces and the other one doesn't. So the diversity creates a situation in which the European support for reforming institutions, for developing the national environment, is very important, and I think facilitating this in the last 20 years has been a very important part of this portfolio. And the third aspect is the budget. Of course, there is no social policy without a budget. And it's also a truism in the European context that what the European Union can add is a minor contribution as compared to the size of welfare budgets within European member states. Nevertheless, what the European Union adds through the European Social Fund and other instruments is absolutely crucial. So that's why I'm speaking about all 3 arms of the governance: legislation, policy coordination, which is also a learning process, but also the budgetary arm through the European Union budget, especially the Social Fund, but also other instruments. So this is one point, that we cannot have a reduced scope just focusing on one arm, which is legislation. The other point I would like to make regarding the how to achieve social Europe and the social progress, the focus on convergence. In the European Union, again, because of the diversity, we have to be aware of diverse experience, but there has to be some assurance that the trends of specific countries regarding economic performance, productivity, but also the capacity to deal with unemployment, to raise the employment rate when it is necessary, to tackle problems like material deprivation, or even income inequality. So we have to have a set of indicators which overall demonstrate a process of convergence. This is also something which is in a bit of technical or technocratic exercise, but this is a necessary component of the governance. We also speak a lot in the European Union about cohesion, cohesion of the EU as a whole, political cohesion, but also social cohesion within the member states. But there's a difference here. Cohesion is what you feel. Convergence is what you can measure. I'm also emphasizing this for those who happen to tweet from this conference, because you need sometimes tweetable statements. This is something tweetable, that we need the concept of convergence with a set of concrete indicators, which is measurable, and somebody, and it happens to be the European Commission again, takes stock of the progress or the lack of the progress with convergence. Difficulties with convergence or divergence as such can indeed destabilize, not only within the national context, but it can have a destabilizing effect on the European Union as a whole. And this is also what we have been witnessing in some countries in the form of various nationalist and populist political tendencies. So convergence is not something which we measure for hobby. It is something we measure because the stakes for the Union as a whole are very high, so convergence should be measurable regarding living conditions, working conditions, employment, as well as poverty rate. And the third point, and I should be shorter on this, is that this is a portfolio which is highly participatory. In every single portfolio of governance, of course, you have partners and stakeholders in the world, but especially this one. The partnership is with business, the partnership is with the representatives of labor, and not only in the European Union level, but also from the member states themselves, or various branches of industry. They all form their own representations of labor, especially, and then there has to be a constant dialogue. I think Europe has been demonstrating an example to the rest of the world in terms of social dialogue. There are very, very advanced forms of it in Europe, but in the last 10 years, including through the so-called G20 process, this kind of social dialogue, tripartism, has been to some extent exported to the rest of the world. With the G20, we saw the rise of B20, Business 20, and L20, Labor 20. So this process actually goes into the world fora. Why? Because it's a good format to create peace and understanding in the economy, among the participants of the economy, but it also helps productivity. This is pretty much the experience in Europe, that the countries with the most advanced forms of social dialogue, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, also happen to be the most productive countries of the European Union, and extremely competitive as well. But the participation and the coordination with the stakeholders in the area of employment and social policy is not only about the world of labor, but also about the various types of social policy actors, those people representing people with disability, various specific groups who are interested in well-functioning social policy, a robust welfare state, including, for example, in several countries of the EU, representatives of the Roma minorities or other ethnic minorities, which have to be able to express their voice and participate in the design as well as the implementation of the policy, which is supposed to help their progress and integration in society as a whole. So I would say that to the question of how Social Europe works and how it is being developed, these little bit methodological issues have to be discussed and appreciated in the European context. And I can only congratulate Marianne Thyssen for the achievements of this cycle, this legislation, because in all aspects, whether it is legislation, improving the existing legislative body and adding new ones, policy coordination through the European semester, as well as strengthening the part of the EU budget which serves the purposes of employment and social investment, there have been many steps forward, and I think this should be appreciated by all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Laszlo. Please be seated. And I think, there are many takeaways from what you have said, but I think the two major points for myself is that for the future, we have to look at this challenge of convergence between the different member states if we want to maintain the European social model. And then, as we did in the past, we have to involve the stakeholders. So it has to be a participatory process if we want to maintain it. I mean, we will have 2 minutes for questions, but I have one burning question, because I don't think that people recall, because our memory is very often very short, but when you became a commissioner, we were in the midst of the crisis, the financial and economic crisis. So you had to handle social affairs, European social affairs, in the midst of that crisis. How did you strike a balance between developing a social policy and then at the same time do crisis management and tackle the structural challenges?
What I would underline is that in the circumstances of a crisis, it's very important to be open to a new analysis and new proposals. For example, at the beginning, we thought that a key issue of the term would be the working time. In reality, youth unemployment became the top issue, which we thought about, but the concrete proposals, like to have a European Youth Guarantee Initiative, came during the crisis. Yeah. And then we had to take this on board, discuss with the stakeholders, and ensure that everybody has the same understanding and robust implementation as well, with additional financial support from the European Union.
Okay, great, great. Is there anybody who has a question or a remark or a suggestion for Mr. Andor? Yes, I see one hand there. Please present yourself and
yes,
be
hello.
precise and short, please.
Yes, Mantla Makalima from the GIZ. My question is, when I lived in Brazil and other South Africa, other countries, social protection was not always socially accepted, especially by the elites who were having some prejudice, saying, why should you give money out to the poor? So how do you, well, it's not necessarily a question to you, but in general, how do you deal with this?
Yes, out of the countries you mentioned, I had the chance to visit Brazil, and that was in 2012, which was a lucky period because we actually witnessed a deepening of the social policy, including in a way, the abolition of the favela and extending social policy measures to people who never even heard about that. Conditional cash transfers, schooling of people who were excluded from all types of social care and possibilities of public education, for which there was also a social imperative, right, to tackle the extreme inequality in the country, but also what we witnessed, for example, in Rio de Janeiro, that there was also a business case. Because the country had a great growth potential, but when the economy can grow, it also needs a skilled and trained workforce, which you cannot deliver in a few weeks or a few months. You have to start with basic education, with kindergarten if possible, and to start marching on that long road it requires a plan, a long-term strategy, and I think it's regrettable that some of the reforms of the previous period are rolled back instead of deepened in a later stage. So it requires a broader social consensus, the agreement of all stakeholders, that this actually benefits the whole country.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Andor. Please remain seated because we will have more questions afterwards. I would like to invite Mr. Satyarthi to the floor, please. Please come. He probably doesn't know it anymore, but it has been 20 years since we have not met each other, because Mr. Satyarthi was organizing the global march against child labor worldwide. 80,000 kilometers were being marched to ask for better rights for children. And I was just a young boy with short pants at that time. I was a director of the Belgian NGO that was coordinating the global march here in Belgium. And I remember that we were sitting together in my office and we went to an Indian restaurant and we had even fun, right? Right? And we went to see the Queen at that time. So Mr. Satyarthi, in the meantime, in 2014, was a recipient of the Nobel Prize for Peace, because of the great work that he has done to create awareness amongst the global community with the march, but also with a lot of media support from CNN and other ones, that we have a major problem with child labor, and that child labor is unacceptable, and that child labor cannot be excused for any reason. Not for social reasons, not for economic reasons, not for the income of the families. I mean, and this is your great achievement. And Mr. Satyarthi, he continued to work on this, also on the call for education for each and for all and for the children. So he has done really great work on child protection. I would like you to just give us some of your insights. I mean, since those 20 years, you have learned, I think, so much, and you have been with the powers that be, and you have not lost your touch with the people who are working on the ground. You're still a community worker, you're still an activist. So just share some of your thoughts on how we can connect social protection and children's protection. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for remembering, and your account of the Global March was moving for me. And I am so proud to see that the people who participated in organized the Global March those days are sitting in very, very high positions and shaping a world which is better for everyone, particularly children. Since yesterday, I participated in many events, and I was quite impressed that we are talking about two major issues. One is the growing inequality in the world, which is concerning, challenging, and the second is fixing the priority of the most marginalized people in the world. And we live in a world when we talk of marginalization or the last person or the person left behind, everything is a child, particularly a girl child, who has been born in slavery, intergenerational slavery. The girl who is most vulnerable for sexual exploitation by the masters or landlords of her parents. The girl who could be sold and bought like animals and sometimes in lesser price than the animals. The girl who is working hard since morning till evening and denied education, health care, freedom and future. She is the girl who is left behind, and while we are sitting here and I'm standing here, we have to keep in mind the face of such a girl or such a boy. But in spite of all these inequalities, 1% people in the world are holding or honor of 50% of wealth of the world. Whereas 700 to 800 million people, if I'm not wrong, would go to bed tonight without proper food in hunger. 263 million children who have to be in school today, they are not. And 152 million children who are toiling day in and day out as child laborers. 50 million children are looking for a safe place tonight or and a square meal food. They are children on move, those who are victims of violence, conflicts, global warming, climate change. They are not numbers. They are breathing human beings. In many other cases, they are not allowed to cry or laugh freely or walk freely. But whose children are they? They are all our children. They are all our children. And when the world started thinking for children more and more, we have seen the changes. Only 20 years ago, The number of child laborers were almost 260 million. That has gone down to 152 million. We are able to make the difference. The difference was possible through combination of strategies, combination of actions, efforts, and so on. And my own experience, say, working across 144 countries on this issue for last several decades, that policies had played very, very important role. The laws and their enforcement, judicial mechanisms. But no less important was the strategy of social protection. Some years ago in Rio, I met a woman. She was so happy, but she remembered that how her elder son had become the victim of violence and shot dead on the streets. He was living on the streets, pavements. But she is happy because 2 of her children are going to school, and the girl was going to complete high school. What was the reason, dear friends? It was possible through Bolsa Familia. It started as Bolsa Escola, and then Bolsa Familia has brought so many other aspects of poverty, hunger, health, education. We have seen the result. I come across many children in my country, India, whose parents, whose brothers, sisters were working as slaves and child laborers, but now they are not because of the 2 major schemes, or so many other schemes. One is the employment guarantee scheme, where the rural employment is guaranteed for at least 100 days a year. And that has helped indirectly in saving the children and sending them to school, not to work as child labor, because the mother and father both were able to earn some money. And the second thing was, they were given some stipend, those who were below the poverty line, but more importantly, almost 160, 150, I can't recall the exact number, but these much children are receiving hot food every day as the midday meal schemes in their schools. That is the largest hot kitchen in the world for those children through this social protection measure. So combination of these helped. We met many children in Bangladesh where the conditional cash transfer and the food for education program combined had helped them to get rid of child labor and child marriages. And not only that, Bangladesh became the first country in our region that had attained the gender equity in primary and secondary education before the big economies like India could do. And this was possible through these schemes. So, dear friends, I underline the importance and I applaud the work of European Commission, European Union has been able to do. You have a proven track record in Europe. Your model have to be replicated and implemented, multiplied in other parts of the world. All the time we have to think that no problem on the earth can be seen and solved in isolation, in silo. Today we are reactive to global warming, but we have not been so active to put an end to poverty in spite of Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals. So, dear friends, I will conclude with 4 major things which are needed. The first one is the sense of urgency. The sense of urgency is needed in the world because they are our children. If we are not able to protect them today through social measures, political measures, economic measures, legal measures, we are losing the huge, immense potential of humankind. In addition to being immoral, unethical, how can we call ourselves civilized when the girls are sold in lesser price than the animals? So it is our collective responsibility, but sense of urgency. And the priority is the second thing. We do so many things, but we have to prioritize those sections which are really marginalized in our thinking, in our action, in our policies, and invest more on them. Most important thing is the investment by the countries, but also by the international community. But I am coming from Ghana, for example, yesterday morning. Ghana is a country which has been investing more than 20% of its budget in education. And there are so many other countries which spend of the same level, 20-25%. And even if they invest 100% of their budget, they are not going to ensure quality, equitable and inclusive education, which we all promised for. So we have to see that how we can invest in that. $1 on eradication of child labor will give the return of $7 in 20 years. That was the World Bank and ILO's research. Investment in education of $1 will give you a return of $15 in next 20 years. There are so much empirical evidences and proofs. So, in addition to policies, in addition to awareness, mass mobilization, participation, we have to ensure that we invest on our children through social protection measures. And finally, I would say that we have to learn, as I was listening, the partnership among and between the countries, but partnership in the communities inside the countries, partnership between and among state actors, civil society actors, and the corporate. So corporate, state, and civil society has to learn living together and working together with mutual trust and mutual respect. This way, we can definitely maximize the impact of social protection measures and programs at the country level and internationally. I once again thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brother Kailash. 5 more minutes, if possible. I think what we learned, I mean, you insisted on the sense of realism and humanism. I mean, it is possible to combat child labor and to combat the lack of social protection of people, also in very difficult circumstances. And you insisted also on the sense of urgency, that we need to act and we have to act together. I mean, I called upon the participants to tweet as much as possible, and so I certainly want to do it after having listened to you. Hopefully a lot of people will spread the message. But I just one single question. I mean, the ILO Convention 182 on combating the worst forms of child labor. To what extent, I mean, you contributed a lot to that, also together with the domestic workers movement of India. To what extent was this leverage also to have this massive movement against the child labor?
Well, first of all, the significant impact of social mobilization through the march was to build a culture of coalition where the trade unions and NGOs who were not willing to come together, the teachers' organizations, educators, corporations, governments, intergovernmental agencies, and faith leaders, we come together and we march together, and that has helped in understanding each other and building some sort of culture of coalition. That was a major impact which is hidden, but we see in many other spheres. Secondly, that has resulted in the unanimous adoption of ILO Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor. That has become the fastest ever ratified convention ever in the world. That is almost universally ratified convention now, and that has helped in the reduction of child labor, the number in measurable terms from almost 260 million to 152 million. The governments have laws and schemes. Laws were synchronized with the international law, and governments have to put or allocate budget for eradication of child labor and combining education. But what is needed more is to mainstream and then mainstream the issue of child labor eradication with the development agenda. And secondly, some sort of holistic approach and convergence of various schemes run by the governments, by various ministries, various departments, and how the social protection measures can prioritize the last child of the society, as well as they have to see that how rest of the schemes run by the governments are converge for the betterment of the children or women left behind.
Thank you so much, and congratulations, and I hope it will not take another 20 years before we meet again, because then I will be completely bald and you might be completely gray.
Yeah. But none of us are going to go back to our half pants.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So then I would like to invite Professor Béa Cantillon. As has been said by the two commissioners, in fact, the world of work has been changing very fast. We have digitization, we have platform workers, where we have globalization, etc. So it has profound consequences on our European social model. So when we have to reflect on that, to what extent is the model that has been generated and built up organically in the different member states, to what extent is it sustainable, and to what extent it has to take into account those effects of globalization, digitization, etc. Béa Cantillon is very well placed for that, because she's both a practitioner and a professor as an academic. She heads the Herman de Leek Institute for Social Policy at the University of Antwerp. She's very renowned in our country, in Belgium. She has been an advisor to the Belgian government also in terms of the reforms of the pension system and the social protection system. And she has been a senator, and presently she's the president of the Federation of the Non-Governmental Development Organizations. And so I think she's very well placed to tell us what the consequences might be of this changing environment. And then next we will have our friend from the Philippines to reflect further on the inspiration that we can take from the European experience for developing countries. Béa, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. Many has already been said. We face big issues for the future, but in order to think about solutions for the future, we should look back. And basically, this is what I did in the past 40 years as an academic. I studied the European social model in relation to poverty issues, in relation to income inequalities. I studied the European social model, and so the question is, what did I learn? And what do we know? And basically, what do we know? Well, we are sure that the European social model did or was successful to create welfare for many, not for all, but for many. And I would say for the first time in the history of mankind, in Europe, we succeeded to have high economic growth, high welfare, and a fair distribution of the welfare. Welfare for many, but not all. And then the question is, what are the main features of this European social model? And I would say three important features. First, and it has been said, protection of workers. Labor market regulation. It's not very fashionable, but it is about labor market regulation. Protection of workers. first. Second, social protection. And social protection, which is basically in the European social model based on the principle of social insurance. Social insurance, and that means solidarity and reciprocity. Social insurance means universality. It's not only social protection for the poor, no, it's social protection for all. We all are involved in social protection system, in social insurances, in the European social model. That means that we all benefit sooner or later from social protection. It's not a model that only benefits the poor. That's the second feature. And the third feature has also been mentioned several times this afternoon, that is that the European welfare state is not from the state, or is not only from the state. Obviously, the state has an important role to play, and it does. However, the European social model, or in the European social model, there is a strong involvement of civil society and social partners. So the European social model is not from the state. In the first place, it is brought by civil society and social partners. So this model has been and still is very successful. European welfare states are the most egalitarian nations in the world. European welfare states witness the lowest poverty rates in the world. And this is thanks to social insurance, worker protection, and the strong involvement of civil society. But, yes, the model is under strain. For many decades, and I would say for 4 decades, more or less, for 4 decades, we do not see any improvement anymore in poverty, in the treatment of people, and especially children, who are less advantaged. On the contrary, poverty, especially child poverty, is increasing in many countries, also in my country. Child poverty is increasing for many years in many EU countries. And this points to difficulties of the European model to respond to new social and economic problems resulting from technological change, globalization, increasing mobility, basically increasing mobility of workers and capital. So, the future. How can we imagine a better future for an even better future for the European social model? And can the European social model still be an example for in other parts of the world? And the answer is, well, we should not reinvent the wheel. The basic features of the success of the European model are still there and should remain the basic features of the future welfare states. However, from a European perspective and from a worldwide perspective, the most important point that we should raise in the future, that is that we should strengthen the social protection and the regulation of labor markets and the protection of workers. But we can't do this within small nation states. We must do this by cooperation. Cooperation, in the first place, within Europe, and the Commissioner Marianne Thyssen and his predecessor, they implemented important steps towards the Europeanization of the national welfare states and Europeanization of social protection schemes. The work that has been done, and that is been done by international organizations, and especially by the ILO these days, these are the places, and these are the places where progress is underway, I would say. So I'm optimistic. The process is underway, but obviously we have a lot of work. A lot of work still has to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm looking at the audience. Is there anybody who has a question or a remark or a suggestion? Yes, sir. Please present yourself briefly.
I'm Joran. Does this work? Yeah, I'm Joran. I'm a researcher, social policy. Thank you for putting people first. It's very encouraging for young people to see that, and people who have made a career in social policy, that you are, in these days, where post-truth days, where integrity, dignity doesn't always, whatever, you get the point. My question really is, there's a statue of a horse in a European city, I forget which one, that's kind of 19th century, majestic, and it's supposed to have a rider on it, maybe a king or a lieutenant or something like that, but it's not there. The point to the statue is that, or the person is not there, the point to the statue is that this patriotic nationalist symbol remains because there's a demand for it, but it doesn't really matter who the rider is. Can a European social model be a rider in these times, the rider to that statue? What are your thoughts on that?
Bea.
Well, I think I spoke about 3 features of European social model. Basically, I would have, there's a 4th important feature, and that is that the European social model and social protection is organized within relatively small nation states. And that is really important because obviously it's much easier to organize solidarity and to organize social protection systems within the context of smaller nations. So it's easier to organize social security in Belgium or in Sweden or in Luxembourg as to do this in the US or to do this in China. So I think this is very important, and so the diversity between national welfare states in the EU, this is something that we should cherish. In the EU talk, this means we should cherish subsidiarity. And so the difficulty in Europe is to find this balance between Europeanization of social policies, but at the same time respecting the differences between national welfare states.
Okay, thank you. I think there's food for debate. I see the lady there with a question. Please present yourself.
Oui, monsieur, je vais le faire. Merci beaucoup. Je m'appelle Marie-Claire Roamia. Je suis membre du Forum interrégional des femmes congolaises. Plus que ça, je n'aurai pas le temps.
A bit louder, please.
Yeah.
Un peu plus haut, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, je crois que je n'aurai pas le temps de me présenter plus que de dire que je suis membre du Forum interrégional des femmes congolaises.
Okay.
Je vais poser une question peut-être rapide. J'espère, j'ai peur d'être à côté de la plaque, mais je la pose quand même à qui veut. Alors, l'immigration, mesdames, messieurs. Bon, je sais qu'on en a beaucoup parlé et tout. Est-ce que c'est une question politique ou bien une question sociale? Je sais qu'elle vous pose beaucoup de problèmes tous en Europe, mais est-ce que c'est simplement une question politique ou bien il y a un accent social? Merci beaucoup.
The lady is asking if migration is only a political problem or if it is also a social problem for Europe.
This is a very difficult question. It's certainly a political problem, but obviously it's also a social problem in the sense that our societies have to adapt and have to, for instance, to create programs in order to give migrants the opportunities to find their way in our societies. And this is very challenging, and in my country we are not very successful, to say the least. For instance, employment rates among migrants are very low. So this and success rates of migrant children in schools are very low in Belgium. This points to the fact that we are not successful as society, as welfare state, in integrating newcomers in our societies. So this is clearly a social problem and obviously also a political problem, which is putting our social protection system and our social systems under strain, and this is probably the most important challenge that we face in the coming years.
Thank you for that question, and I now realize that I've forgot to introduce myself. I'm Patrick de Velter from the European Political Strategy Center, which is the in-house think tank, and our job is to provoke the system. So I would say, apart from migration being a problem, it's also a social opportunity. We need, for the next 30 years, about 60 million migrants if we want our social security systems in Europe to remain fiscally sustainable. That's one. Secondly, I also think it's an opportunity because by bringing in migrants, you also bring in new ideas, new cultures, new dynamism. And we know that all great empires that have existed and have gone down the drain is because at one point in time they stopped accepting to pick the brains of people from other cultures. So I just say that to provoke, so so that you can discuss that later on when you have a beer or a coffee. So we're going to invite now I know there's some more questions, but we'll have this for later. We'll have this for later, afterwards. I would like to first invite our last speaker, who is a youngster, Lawrence Balabat from the Philippines. And Lawrence is still a student. He's doing an MA in political economy at a university in Manila, the University of Asia and the Pacific. And he's not only a student, he has been an activist for a long time, working with poor communities in the Philippines. He is also involved in an American non-profit organization, the Miracle Corners of the World in New York. He's a mentor there, and he's also a social entrepreneur. So it's a person with a lot of talents and a lot of dynamism. So Lawrence, I would really like to invite you here to maybe also provoke us and tell us a little more about how you see, in fact, what the challenges are of building social protection systems and a social model in developing countries.
Okay, I'm short. Oh, there you go. Hi, so first of all, I would like to thank again the European Commission for this opportunity. I believe that as the representative of the youth and coming from a developing country, it is my responsibility to just put it out there, say it explicitly. Social protection is losing momentum in the global south. This is alarming, but this is the reality. Social welfare policies are being undermined, unprioritized, and they are being caught up because of our pursuit for rapid economic growth and industrialization. I believe that if you don't achieve a significant level of success in establishing a globally universal social protection system that covers at least 75% of the world population in 5 years' time, it would be very difficult to achieve any other sustainable development goals. So, one of the questions that always resonates in me is, why do we only have to take action when there is no more chance to get out of the situation? I remember after the 2008 global financial crisis, there was a skyrocketing of investment in social protection, and that was incredible. 24% of fiscal stimulus was directed towards putting 5 billion people back on their feet. We should have learned from this situation, and we should have made sure that no one is left behind, that everyone is secure. However, 6 years later, in 2014, still 5 billion people in the developing world are still not covered by a comprehensive social protection policy. And can you guess the statistics that we have today? Still 5 billion people in the global south do not have access to a full range of social protection programs. It got me thinking with this opportunity to stand here, how many more high-level panels, how many more conventions, conferences, dialogues, agreements do we have to do until we realize that social security shouldn't be even debated anymore? We shouldn't even debate whether or not we should include social inclusion in our development agenda. When will we realize that social security is a human right? And for as long as we are not treating it as it is, we are far from sustainable development. Social protection should always be about prevention. It should never be about cure. I'm here to talk about the challenges of social protection systems in the developing world, and I'm coming from the Philippines. We've had much success in our welfare programs, but we share certain challenges with other developing nations. And I would like to take some time to talk about those. So, one of the key challenges in social protection systems in the developing world is narrow coverage. So this is due to two reasons. First is the lack of information outreach about the benefits and importance of social protection. For several years, I have been working with and doing extensive research in some of the poorest communities in the Philippines. And some of the resonating questions that people always throw at me is, what in the world is social protection? Do we really need social protection? I can just use my money for my food tomorrow. So the lack of awareness as to the importance, genuine benefits, say, of social insurance is one of the most fundamental constraints to establishing an inclusive and sustainable social protection system in the global south. The second reason is that informal economy workers, which compose almost 80% of the labor force in the Philippines, cannot afford health insurance and social security premiums. How can you expect a street vendor in Manila to contribute a part of his $4 daily earning for social security when that even is not enough to get him through the day? Most governments do not have the capacity to subsidize social insurance premiums. And even if they do, it is not a sustainable solution. Social insurance programs should have the flexibility and it should be tailored to accommodate and cater different levels of income. And this is where the EU social market economy model can help us through technical assistance, South-South cooperation, EU-South cooperation, in terms of institutional capacity, coordination, knowledge transfer, and so many aspects we can learn from the model. Another leading challenge in developing countries is the lack of coordination among different government agencies working on social protection. In the Philippines, for example, there are several agencies working separately for private sector employees insurance, public sector employees insurance, the general health insurance, social cash transfers, labor market integration, and this sort of fragmentation is a bottleneck to effective implementation. Therefore, I believe that if we do have international cooperation, if we do involve ourselves with transferring knowledge on how to streamline and rationalize implementation of social protection policies, we can do this together. The EU has done it, the world can do it also. The third leading challenge to expanding coverage in developing countries is adequate financing, and I guess we all know that. Governments have to increase spending in social protection, and it would be preferable if it reaches at least 6% of the country's GDP. So bridging this financing gap can do a lot to bringing us closer to a global universal social protection system. I would also like to touch on the idea of cash transfers because I've done much work on this field. In the Philippines, we just a couple of months ago, we institutionalized our conditional cash transfer scheme, which was a huge success for social protection enthusiasts. However, governments should remember that cash transfers should never be the end goal. It should be a stepping stone to a more comprehensive social protection policy. I would like to end by saying that social security is a human right, and it should never be taken for granted. For many people, when they hear social protection, it doesn't ring a bell. Social protection doesn't have the same charm as education, child rights, healthcare, climate change. But that's because social protection is so entrenched that it penetrates all those fields. Social protection is the entry point to solving so many problems, to attaining so many sustainable development goals. If only I can bring back time to the months following the 2008 financial crisis, when social protection had the global limelight, when governments funneled money, so much money to social protection. Maybe if I could bring that time back, there would be more people in this room. Let's not forget that we do not need a crisis for us to take action. We do not need income shocks. We do not need people getting unemployed, losing their jobs for us to take action. As youth, we should reclaim our seats at the table. As youth, we should bring our voices and ensure that social protection, universal social protection, is achieved by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. You certainly brought your voice to this audience. We are running out of time, but I think we still have time, for maybe 2 questions. There was a gentleman, James, you had a question? And then there's another gentleman, and there's the lady. Okay, let's keep it with those 3 questions.
Well, in fact, my question was quite well answered by Balabat's presentation, but really I wanted to question our European experts on the hypothesis that the European social model can really be seen as an example, as a model to follow in developing countries, in Africa, say, given not just the need for the political commitment, but also the high financial cost. And that, to me, I think is one of the most, the biggest problems, and I think the examples from the Philippines we've just heard have shown how difficult that is. So I wondered if you had any reflection on how the European social model might be affordable by developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, James. James is from the ECDPM, one of the big think tanks here in town, European Center for Development Policy Management. Then the gentleman.
Good afternoon. My name is Ruben. I'm a young leader from 3 years ago, but I'm a returnee. So my question is to the EU model. We see that there is a changing of shifts in terms of populist governments. How do we ensure that social protection is not politicized and still be sustainable, that is inclusive for all? Thank you.
Yes, then our colleague from the DG Employment.
Thank you. Mrs. Cantillon, when you have given the solution, or at least the line for the future, you gave the advice not to change too much the wheel of the system. But what if the car has changed so much that those wheels do not any longer fit? So if we keep on the line, what would you change nevertheless with the changing world? Because the economy is no longer the one of 40 years ago. Population is aging. The work is changing. The world of work is changing. So if you had one thing to change to keep the same wheel, but let's say to adapt it to the new situation, what would you change?
Okay, and then the last question. And then we'll ask the three panelists to answer whatever they want to answer.
My name is Hannah Molly. I'm a consultant in Brussels on peace, migration, and security. I have a question for the commissioner and for the professor. I wonder if, after all these years of social reform, of social security systems, which has been, there are so many insights about it. When did the backlog of women on the social market, on the labor market, when do it gonna stop? How do we gonna find out what kind of methods and what kind of visions we should implement to stop the backlog of women on the labor market? That's my question to the professor and to the commissioner. But my question to Mr. from the Philippines, thank you for your very insight speech. My question is, you have talked about people in the Philippines who don't have, an idea about social security systems. But did you know that a lot of your people, a lot of Filipinos are coming to Europe, and they also have very less social security here in Europe, and they are workers from the lowest income. You know that they are migrant workers mostly.
Okay, so I think basically we have 5 questions. I will ask each of the panelists to react to whatever question they want to react to. Mr. Commissioner.
Yes, I would like to start with the question of affordability, because this is a very frequent one regarding the European social model. And what I would stress is that for most of us, by and large, the European social model is a very profitable business. It's not something which you would spend on because you have some leftover money and you have nothing to do with it. This is something which helps to enhance the productivity of European nations. Why? Because, for example, if you provide free or cheap healthcare for wide sections of the population, it means that people at a later stage will not need to rely so much on ad hoc assistance, and then they can remain strong, healthy, and productive for much of the adult life. So there are many, many aspects which, through what we call social investment, or simply because of risk sharing, ensure that there is a cohesive society which can free itself from unnecessary shocks or breakdowns of the community or of the workplace. Professor Cantillon was emphasizing also the importance of insurance. And insurance, by definition, is about sharing the risk and creating more resilience in the system. And in a way, this is the secret. I'm not saying that every type of spending is this type of productive. There are many other parts which simply represent solidarity, simply represent a kind of a commitment of members of society to each other. And that's why people want to insist on that and maintain it. But the history of the European welfare state is not a history of first become productive and at the end, when there is surplus money, you also distribute it. Much of the welfare reforms came in the early 20th century, in Germany even before. Because of national unification, creating nation states and adding a social dimension to the concept of citizenship, created the welfare state alongside industrial development. In a way, as much as industry develops in a country, whether it's a European or non-European country, workers will demand workplace protection, workplace regulation. So this is simply, in a way, a consequence of industrial development, that this endeavor will come up, and in democratic circumstances, it will result in a certain type of legislation. And on the other hand, when nation building also proceeds, and in a democratic process, nations will develop the social aspect of citizenship, then these institutions of risk sharing and social protection will also develop. I'm not saying in a uniform way, but the principle, I think, can go from one continent to another through these long-term trends of economic, political and social development.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Professor, there was one particular question addressed to you.
Yes.
What is the single
about the change.
most important thing
Yes.
that you would like to change?
Yes, many thanks for this question. So what would I change without reinventing the wheel? What I would say is what we need in Europe and beyond, that is an adequate social floor. An adequate social floor because of the many changes on the labor market, because of the strain on social protection systems, social insurance systems, because of increasing mobility. I think that what we need is a social floor for those in work and those out of work. So this means minimum wage, a minimum wage floor, obviously taking into account the specific economic situation and labor market situation in different countries. So a minimum wage relative to average wages, and minimum income protection for jobless households, defined at an EU level, because I don't think that it is, no, I would say it in another way, because we need cooperation. Even the strongest welfare states, even my country is not able to protect adequately jobless households. And even rich and strong, developed welfare states such as Belgium needs the cooperation of the others. And so what I would change is a European social floor. And I would just add something on the cost, the question of the cost. I fully agree with what Anders said. Just I would like to add two elements to that. The first element is that the European social model, it took us 200 years to have the model and to have the social protection systems as they exist today. 200 years. It started bottom up, and that's very important. That's again the importance of civil society, the importance of and the role of social partners. It started bottom up, and slowly it evolved. Slowly, and it took a long time. Secondly, if we take, and just it's an example reinforcing your argument, if we take healthcare spending, healthcare spending in public schemes, it's much lower than healthcare spending in private schemes. Healthcare spending in the US is much, much higher than healthcare spending in European welfare states where we have public healthcare systems. So this is just an example reinforcing your argument of the fact that social spending is not just spending. There is a return. There is a return on investment, and that should be taken into account.
Okay, thank you. It's indeed an investment. And then Lawrence?
Yes, so I would like to bring up again the challenge that I brought up earlier, the first one. So it's about the lack of information outreach. The Philippines has a very unique geographic orientation. We are composed of 7,146 islands, and the level and degree of informality in our labor force is continually expanding. And so the existing information communication strategies by the government can be improved. So what I'm referring to mostly is social insurance. So there are different kinds of informal economies in the Philippines, and oftentimes the available projects, schemes, social protection programs are existing, but they are not being relayed to the people efficiently. So it can be improved on how to avail it, how to maintain the participation in the program. So that still remains as one of the key challenges, maintaining engagement with the citizens, especially those in the informal economy.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, for me, a couple of takeaways, apart from this tropical environment in which we are getting. I think what has become very clear during the session is that a social model is a homegrown model. Somebody said it's bottom-up, we build it up in a bottom-up way. I think secondly, what the Commissioner Thijssen said, there's no contradiction between the social and the economic, and this is also what you stressed, Commissioner. It can be a profitable model, but as you said, we need convergence here in Europe. And I think very importantly, our Nobel Prize winner, he insisted on the fact that it's not all about the economy, it's also about social rights. This is also what you said, Lawrence, it's about social rights of people. And then if you go for social protection systems, it's about universality, it's about reciprocity, it's about solidarity. But unfortunately, in many places, we are losing momentum in terms of developing social protection systems. This is the case in certain European countries, but also in many developing nations. And this is why I would like to congratulate and thank the two Directorate Generals who organized this session, being DG Employment and DG DevCo. Thank you so much. And I would like to ask for a warm round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much.